So my next speaker is from Liverpool John Moores University. Not talking about psychedelics, I hasten to add, but don't boo up. That's not, you have to be nice to her. That's all right. But she is talking about psychoactive drugs. There's not really been much research done, hardly any, in fact, on psychedelics and perceptions of time. But there has been some research done on some other drugs, and so we're very lucky to have Cathy Montgomery here. She is a cognitive psychologist, actually, more or less. Psychopharmacologist, okay, I'll take that all the way back. And, well, her talk is time flies when you're having drugs, not when you're having fun, as somebody wrote the program, probably me. The role of emotion, attention, and neurotransmitters in human timing.
Thank you. Okay, so as Dave very quickly said, I'm not a mainstream psychedelic researcher, but most of my research does focus on the effects of psychomotor stimulants. So I tend to research ecstasy and cocaine, and to a lesser extent cannabis. So my talk today is going to focus on what we currently know about human timing, so how we actually measure time in our brains, and how this might actually be applicable to the role of different neurochemicals when you've taken drugs, so why our time might warp after we've taken certain drugs. So time very, very rarely seems to be passing at a constant rate. Instead, it seems to expand and contract in front of us depending on what we're doing. And this is especially pertinent when we've taken some kind of substance that alters our consciousness. Now, while clock-based time, as we know it, seems to be passing at a constant rate, our subjective experience tells us that the amount of time we perceive to have passed actually varies quite a lot. And this can lead us to experience distortions in the passage of time, such as time passing much more rapidly or time passing much more slowly. So what I'm going to talk about today is the reasons why we perceive time to pass more quickly or more slowly, and the role of emotion and attention, regardless of whether you've taken drugs, seem to be much more important in your perception of time. So very quickly, some boring cognitive models of human timing. In terms of psychology, time is actually timed by an internal clock. So we all have our internal mechanism for keeping time, and if we're consciously aware of this, then the top line shows the main model. So we have a pacemaker, and this pacemaker emits ticks or pulses continuously. And these ticks and pulses gather in an accumulator, and the accumulator measures these. So the more ticks and pulses that you accumulate from your pacemaker, the more time you think have passed. So the more ticks that you have means greater time. And connecting these two things, you have a mode switch. And this mode switch is particularly important in drug-related changes in timing, because this mode switch acts as your attention to time. So if your mode switch is activated, you're paying a lot of attention to time, you're going to be able to time very accurately. Now, not as important, but still very relevant, are the memory stages of timing. So obviously, if you're emitting ticks and pulses from this pacemaker, they're gathering in this accumulator, and you're trying to assess how much time has passed, you're going to need something to actually support this representation in your memory. So you have reference memory, which is short-term memory. This is used when you're judging very short durations, less than 2 seconds. And then you have working memory, which is an online manipulation process where you'll be accumulating these ticks if it's for a longer representation. And while we don't think of time as being very relevant to us a lot of the time, time is actually very important for your survival, so you've got to know when to feed yourself. For movement, so motor timing is very, very important in your interactions with other people. You're going to successfully have non-verbal communication. And if you're going to plan anything, so if you're going to prospectively plan doing something in the future, you need to have an accurate sense of what time is. So throughout a to-be timed event, your clock will produce ticks, and it's these ticks which we count. The number of ticks is the amount of time, with more ticks being more time. Now we know we have this pacemaker accumulator model, because when you plot this on a graph, you have a very nice slope effect. So the more time that goes on, the more ticks that are produced, or the more time you estimate has gone by. And this slope effect is seen as evidence for a pacemaker accumulator clock in general. But what's very nice is that when we give people drugs or when we try and manipulate this pacemaker accumulator model, then you get a difference in slope effect. So for example, if you've got people who've had a placebo versus people that have had psilocybin, you see a very nice difference in their slope effect, indicating that the pacemaker accumulator clock has actually been changed. There are a number of different judgments you can make about time. So it can be done prospectively, and this is when you're alerted to the importance of time prior to the presentation of a stimulus. So this is very much a conscious process, and usually is for judgments of less than 2 seconds. But the problem is that if you're alerted to the importance of time before timing something, then you can count. You can also have retrospective timing, where you're alerted to the importance after presentation of a stimulus. Or what's more important for drug-related research is a passage of time judgment. So usually you'll be thinking about how time is passing when you're intoxicated, and this is a much more pertinent way to measure it. And in the laboratory, we'd usually do this via a verbal estimation. So this is where I present you with a tone or a light, and you would produce a numeric estimate of the duration of this event. And these are usually for less than 2 seconds. If we want to measure actually how humans time using the pacemaker accumulator model, then we need to do it as less than 2 seconds, so we're negating the role of memory processes in this. We also use temporal generalization, so this is where I would play you a standard tone, and then I would play you lots of different comparisons, and you just have to say yes or no as to whether the tones that you're hearing are the same or different. Or a production task where I give you a standard and you have to hold down a key to basically reproduce the standard that I've given you. And all these are very nicely used with different psychophysiological methods such as EEG. So they're all very nice measures of timing, even if you don't have the behavioural measure. Just a couple of things to note in clock speed before I start talking about the drug-related research, is that if we're using an estimate of timing, so if I ask you to estimate how much time has passed, if we've increased the speed of your internal clock, so you have more and more ticks and pulses being accumulated in your accumulator, then your estimate of clock speed will increase. So if we increase the speed of your clock, your estimated duration will increase. But if I ask you to reproduce how long something has lasted for, then as your clock speed increases, your production will actually decrease. And this is because if your clock usually ticks at, for example, 50 times per second, and your clock's actually working faster because you've had some kind of psychoactive substance, then you accumulate more ticks over that second than you would have done if you weren't taking any substance. And then for when you go to produce your production, you will actually produce it before a second compared to when your clock was lower before. So estimates of duration increase as clock speed increases, whereas productions will decrease as clock speed increases because you have accumulated more ticks and you have preemptive responding. Interesting findings in timing research, or what I think is interesting, is that most people can actually time with very surprising accuracy. So people say, oh, I lost track of time, or I'm rubbish at keeping time. Actually, in lab tasks, people are very, very good at doing this within milliseconds of accuracy. Babies, children, the elderly, pigeons, rats, all very, very good at it. Not all stimuli are judged equally, so listening to tones are perceived to last longer than looking at lights. Things that scare you are perceived as lasting longer than things that are neutral. And if you like something or find it attractive, then this also lasts longer. But much more importantly for what we're interested in is that biological and clinical processes alter your perception of the passage of time. So for example, a change in core body temperature, change in neurochemical levels, and this is particularly related to dopamine, although there might be a lesser role for serotonin. The change in dopamine levels, which is one of your key neurotransmitters, seem to be very, very important in this. Now in animals, very early studies in time perception have used drugs to measure timing in animals. And one of the seminal studies by Warren Meck looked at training rats and administering them with methamphetamine versus haloperidol. Now, the rats were trained to press a lever after 12 seconds, and if they waited for exactly 12 seconds, then they would receive some kind of reward. And they were very, very good at this. In general, when they didn't have any drugs at all, they would press the lever at exactly 12 seconds. And in the initial study, they were either administered methamphetamine, which, as I'm sure you know, is a dopamine agonist, so methamphetamine will increase levels of dopamine in the brain, or they were given haloperidol, which is a dopamine antagonist, so giving them haloperidol would decrease levels of dopamine in the brain. And they found that when given methamphetamine, the animals pressed the lever much sooner than they were supposed to, so much quicker than 12 seconds, whereas when they were given haloperidol, they waited a lot longer and pressed the lever after 12 seconds. And then in a follow-up study using marijuana and cocaine instead, they found the same effect. So cocaine, the rats responded a lot sooner, whereas with marijuana, they responded a lot later. And what they suggested the reason for this was that methamphetamine and cocaine, which increase levels of dopamine, speed up the internal clock, so you have more and more ticks being collected. So you actually think that 12 seconds has passed a lot sooner than it has, whereas the opposite is true for marijuana and haloperidol. And if they were given placebo, then the rats were pretty accurate at doing it anyway. So in terms of drugs, this led people to believe that in animals, the clock speed appears to be dopamine sensitive. Dopamine agonists will increase the speed of the clock so you respond sooner. And this, in humans, if you were asking them about passage of time judgment, this would lead to your sense that time is actually passing more slowly than it is. So if you think if your clock's working a lot faster, you have more ticks and pulses emitted, you respond a lot sooner, and you think that time has actually slowed down because when you respond, you perceive that 12 seconds have passed when in fact only 8 seconds has passed. So the speeding up of the internal clock and responding sooner indicates that time is passing much more slowly than you think. Dopamine antagonists decrease the speed of your clock, meaning that you respond later, and this in humans would be indicative of a perception that time is actually passing much more faster than it had been doing. Dopamine changes for this must happen in striatal areas, so things that increase dopamine in prefrontal areas like ketamine don't seem to have the same kind of effect, so the changes must occur in areas of the striatum. Now in humans, where we see differences in time perception when on drug, the role of dopamine in timing is very, very unclear. Parkinson's patients who have naturally lower levels of dopamine don't seem to show timing deficits. And if you give haloperidol to humans, it only affects timing of very, very short durations. There doesn't seem to be an effect in humans. So there must be something different that's happening in humans that isn't related to the neurochemical effects of drugs. Now, one of the most common things that's reported when you've taken psychedelics in an altered state of consciousness is that there are very big differences in the perception of time. So, for example, in Confessions of an English Opium Eater, Thomas de Quincey reported very severe distortions in the passage of time, such that he sometimes seemed to have lived for 70 or 100 years in one night, and sometimes had feelings representative of a millennium that had passed in that time. Similarly, in Doors of Perception, Aldous Huxley reported that he spent several minutes, or was it several centuries, gazing at things, so a big distortion in the passage of time. And when talking of, that was after mescaline and LSD, and Strassman also wrote of DMT, past, present and future merged together into a timeless moment. So in humans there seems to be something that's happening in time perception after taking a range of drugs, but we don't know whether this is related to the increases or decreases in internal clock speed. So initially we performed a study looking at subjective reports of perceptions of the passage of time after taking a range of drugs. Now, participants were 203 university students, and they reported taking a large range of drugs in order of frequency. Obviously, alcohol and nicotine were used by pretty much everyone. Cocaine, amphetamine, ecstasy, poppers, ketamine, and to a lesser extent LSD. So we had a relatively low use of psychedelics in the sample, but a reasonable use of psychomotor stimulants. And this is very under-researched. There are no tools for measuring, or no empirical tools for measuring temporal perception in drug users. So we gave them a substance use inventory to see what type of drugs they took, and a temporal perception questionnaire which we developed ourselves in conjunction with John Weirden, who's kind of the father of temporal perception in humans. So, included items like taking drugs affects my perception of time. I frequently think about the passage of time. When time passes more quickly, I am generally happy, sad, bored, having fun, etc. And also some open-ended questions where we encourage them to describe alterations in subjective time. And this is both when they were on drug or when they were off drug. And we used content analysis to analyse the frequency of the use of drugs when they were actually describing distortions in the passage of time, what activities they were doing, what emotions they were feeling, and also the direction of the alterations in the perception of time. So whether time seemed to be passing more slowly or more quickly when they were taking drugs. And what we found was that the table, so the left-hand column shows reports of time passing more quickly, whereas the right-hand column shows reports of time passing more slowly. So you can see that overall, regardless of whether you were taking any kind of drug or not, distortions where time passed more quickly were much more frequently reported than when time passed more slowly. And in the drug-using group, time distortions were reported much more frequently than in the non-drug using group. So just taking any kind of drug at all seemed to increase your distortions in the passage of time. This was particularly true for alcohol and cocaine. So taking alcohol and cocaine seemed to make time pass more quickly in the distortions. If you reported taking no drug, or if you reported taking cannabis or MDMA, then you seem to have equal numbers of distortions with time passing more quickly and time passing more slowly. Now with cannabis in particular, this was more related to what you were doing while you were taking it. So if you reported taking cannabis and being very stimulated, then time seems to pass more quickly. Whereas if you reported taking cannabis and doing nothing, so a lot of people reported that they would sit at home smoking on their own, and that this distorted time to passing much more slowly. I'm going to have to speed up slightly now. Okay, one of the things I want to talk about in a minute is the role of activity and emotion in human timing. And so we looked at the data, regardless of whether they had taken a drug or not, just to what they were doing when they were actually reporting these distortions. And regardless of taking the drug, distortions were reported as time passing more quickly if you were with friends or family, or partying. And time passing more quickly was also associated with positive emotions like being happy or excited, as you might imagine. So after we'd done this initial study, we looked at the separate adjectives for time passing more quickly and slowly. Being busy and happy was associated, and concentrating, was associated with time passing more quickly, whereas being bored or sad or tired was associated with time being very slow. Now if we look at this, drugs which are consistently associated with increases in dopamine like alcohol and cocaine, in the first table they were consistently associated with time passing more quickly. Now in the animal studies, if you give the animals a drug which increases dopamine, they actually responded much more quickly, which is indicative of the opposite direction. So the animals responding more quickly indicated that their internal clock had speeded up. Now what we're seeing with humans is actually if they've taken a drug which increases dopamine, time is passing more quickly. Whereas for the animals it's opposite. So in humans it seems to be different. So we sought to then look at this in a more objective way and influence the levels of dopamine ourselves. So I'll skip through those couple of slides. But what we did was we administered 0.4 grams of alcohol per kilogram of body weight to 58 participants. They were randomly allocated to either the alcohol or placebo condition, and we measured their internal clock speed by a verbal estimation. So they had to estimate how much time they thought had passed based on a standard duration that we gave them, or they had to say whether a tone was the same or different to a comparison tone. And they all reported feeling subjectively drunk after drinking the alcohol, so we know that our manipulation worked. And if you remember at the beginning, I said that differences in the slope of timing are indicative of changes in internal clock speed. And you can see after having alcohol, there was a change in internal clock speed. So there were significant differences in slope, indicating that alcohol had actually reduced their estimates. The same for generalization. There's a significant effect of alcohol, indicating that alcohol meant that they gave more yes responses at the higher end of timing. And if you model this is very boring. Basically what happened was, for both of the tasks, timing was not more variable, so they were still giving estimates within the range of time, but alcohol led to a systematic underestimation of duration. And this underestimation is consistent with a reduction in internal clock speed. And this is exactly the opposite of what we see in animals. So after looking at this, we thought maybe it wasn't dopamine that was important. So maybe it's not dopamine, maybe it's another neurochemical. And this is where Whitman and colleagues have come in administering psilocybin to participants. So they gave either placebo, 115 micrograms per kilogram, or 250 micrograms per kilogram of psilocybin to participants. And they did the same kind of tasks, so they did temporal reproduction and finger tapping, and also gave some working memory tasks. And you can see on both of these doses, for both of the doses at the lower end of estimation, so where they had to reproduce very, very short durations, under 2.5 seconds, there was no difference between the groups. Whereas when they had to reproduce very long durations, you have differences in the slope of all of those lines. So very long durations seem to be impaired by the administration of psilocybin. Now what they suggested was that these distortions in time were not actually related to changes in your internal clock speed when you're taking psilocybin. They proposed the reasons why you have changes in time perception when you've taken psilocybin is actually because your working memory is impaired. So if you remember, the first stage of the model is your pacemaker accumulator. The second stage is how this is represented in your memory. And because the deficits under psilocybin were only present in the longer time category, Whitman and colleagues proposed the reason for this is because your working memory is impaired when you've taken the drug, so you can't actually represent time in your brain. You can't maintain the representation, and this is why you have changes in your perception of the passage of time. So very quickly, just to go through, going back to the study we looked at when we looked at people's subjective perceptions of the passage of time, regardless of what drug they'd taken, timing was very much associated with positive emotions, and this is in line with anecdotal evidence of time flies when you're having fun. So time flies when you're having fun, or drugs, or both. Time drags when you're bored. And emotion seems to be very relevant. So, for example, people report that when they have something which is threatening them physically, then time seems to slow down a lot. So I was in a car crash, and when I realised the car was about to hit me, time really, really slowed down. Everything seems to pass in front of your eyes. And outside the area of drugs, again, if you look at phobic people, so people who have an intense fear of something, if you expose them to their phobia, then this leads to an increase in arousal, and this leads to an overproduction of time. So if you're phobic and you get put in an intense emotional situation, you produce longer estimates. So it could be that the effects of emotion are actually affecting our time perception when we're on drugs rather than the neurochemical basis itself. But what's actually more likely, and the final thing I wanted to talk about, is that time isn't really very important to us when we've taken psychedelics. So one of the most common reports when you've taken some kind of psychedelic drug is that time becomes meaningless to you. And it's likely that, as I was saying with the model before, where you have the pacemaker, and you have the accumulator, and you have the switch in between which acts as your attention to time, the reason that you have the distortions in the passage of time is actually because time doesn't mean anything to you, so your mode switch is not activated, or you're paying less attention to it. So the animal results and the human results were very, very difficult to reconcile with each other. And if you're doing something which you're enjoying, and timing is very important to you, and if the demands of a competing task are very, very high, then this will result in time disruption, or disruption to your temporal processing. So it may be your internal clock's working exactly the same speed, but you're not actually picking up all of these ticks as they're going through. And this will lead to the sensation that time is passing much more quickly, or much more slowly, depending on your mode switch. Also, as well as this, you might get intoxication-related changes in attention. So MDMA can facilitate attention, meaning that you pay more attention, or it can impair attention. Similarly, depending on dosage, cannabis can impair attention. Alcohol and LSD have both been shown to impair attention, especially at higher doses. So you don't actually have some kind of problem with your internal timing mechanism per se. It doesn't affect your internal clock speed. It just decreases your attention to time because you're actually doing some kind of fulfilling, rewarding activity that means you don't really care about time at all. So, just to conclude, scalar expectancy theory, which is the human model of timing, can explain timing in animal models and appears to be dopamine sensitive, but in humans, dopamine doesn't seem to be very important. The only thing that seems to be very important in psilocybin is that serotonin modulates working memory, so you might not be able to represent time as well, leading to distortions in the passage of time. And if you're in an altered state of consciousness, emotion and your attentional ability are going to be much more important indicators of time. And what we really, really need to do is have administration studies where we can actually look at the architecture of time rather than just like seeing if people have the ability to time. We need to understand how people are timing and how they view the distortions after they've taken the drugs. As we heard from David Nutt yesterday, it's very difficult to get ethical approval and then get your hands on the drugs once you've actually done this, especially in the UK. Thank you.